want to show you a picture of my dog's nostrils. Finnegan, his nose is, I'll tell you about it. It's ebony black. It's pebbled. His nostril openings are kind of the shape of bass clefs. He often will try to poke it into your pocket or into a bag if it's available. I have another dog, Upton, whose nose is quite different. It's visibly cleft in the middle. It's manned by little hairs standing at attention around it, and he will often have his nose up in the air on the breeze, sniffing for scents from down the block. So those are my dogs. Those are my dogs' noses. And in fact, I've written a book about their noses, also about all dogs' noses. And it's really about all dogs. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I got into writing a book about dog noses, and a little bit about what I did for the book before am joined by Daniel and we have a conversation. So if we can see the slides, great. If not, I will just act out the slides. That's fine. Okay, well, I'll start with that. This book, like all of my books, is about a dog, partly because I'm really interested in the ordinary things that are right in front of us, but that we barely see. Dogs are one of them. They are ubiquitous in our culture. I consider them anthropologists among us because they learn about us. If you have a dog in a room with you, the dog is in the corner studying you, learning your behaviors, learning your habits. But we have barely spent any time learning about the dog. This has started to change. Now the field of dog cognition has come in, and suddenly we are studying dogs empirically, and I am among the dog cognition researchers. The other ordinary thing that's right in front of us that nobody's studying is the nose. I mean, we all have a nose, but have you spent much time thinking about your nose? Oh, there's Finnegan's. Wonderful. This is a fabulous picture that was featured in the Times last week, if you happen to catch it. Thank you. And the nose on your face probably hasn't been getting much attention. I'm not writing about dog noses because I've spent my life thinking about noses. I haven't spent my life thinking about smelling. But I have had dogs in my life, and from the time I got to graduate school, and I had an epiphany that if I wanted to study animal minds, and I was looking for subjects to study, and I needed subjects who were playing a lot, who I could see playing a lot, and I was walking 3 times a day with my dog to go play in the park, that maybe I should study dogs. And I did then, and I have been continuously studying dogs at graduate school, and for the last 16 years I've had a dog cognition lab in New York City where we do simple behavioral experiments with dogs. Most of these experiments are about what dogs recognize about us. As I say, they're watching us, and so they see what we're doing. They're very attuned to our gaze, our points. They know our levels of attention. They know the difference between you reading a book, you watching the TV, and you out of the room in terms of what they can get away with in the room. But what hadn't been noticed until surprisingly recently was what their perceptual world is like. And that's what I got very interested in when I wrote my last book. Their perceptual world is basically about this, right? We all know that dogs are good smellers, but we hadn't quite appreciated until recently with a convergence of evidence from physiologists, from people studying behavior, and even from people studying fluid dynamics, how good a smeller they were. And so part of what I did in the book was try to figure out what dogs can do and how they do what they do. A little bit of how they do what they do has to do with the difference in their nose and ours. So a little bit about their physiology. Well, all of us have noses that have olfactory receptor cells, smell receptors, back here, right between the eyes. We have about 5 million smell receptors. The odors can come up our nose, hit one of those receptors, and ping, we smell something. Well, dogs have hundreds of millions more smell receptors than we do. So that allows them to enjoy, appreciate, notice a much wider variety of odors in the world They have different types of receptors than we do. So where we have 3 color receptors, for instance, imagine having 100 color receptors. What kind of kaleidoscopic world might that be? They also have what I call a second nose. We'd consider this the first nose that we're all familiar with. But if you look inside, above the roof of their mouth and below the nasal septum, the part that divides the nose, is something called a vomeronasal organ. It doesn't have to do with vomit, though it sounds like it. What it is an organ which many animals have, we no longer do, which actually allows them to smell hormones and pheromones. These are things which they absorb through the tissue of their nose and detect in a different olfactory way. Their nose might be wet, as a matter of fact, in order that they can get these things into their nose to be sniffed. People who study fluid dynamics, which is an entirely different field, not concerned with dogs per se, have happily turned their attention to the sniff, which is, in fact, a field of study now. And they've told us all sorts of things about the snout of the dog nose. So the dog's nose is better than ours because, for instance, inside, if you zoomed in, it has all these curly-Q bones called turbinate bones, and they do a number of things. They humidify the air that gets smelled in. They warm the air. They filter out any air particles that shouldn't be there, and they race the air toward the epithelial tissue, the receptor cells, where they're going to be sniffed. It's so complex. This is what our brain looks like, essentially, in its convolutions, compared to our nose, for instance. Those are the 3 turbinate bones we have. So we have a much different kind of structure. Another way they can smell so well is that they actually have 2 roots for smelling in their nose, for inspiration, for inhaling in their nose. One goes straight to the lungs. When we breathe, that's a way of getting air into our lungs. The other goes just for smelling. So they have a dedicated smell route in their nose. For us, we don't really. If you inhale normally, you probably don't smell anything. What did you smell today, for instance? Maybe one thing, maybe a couple of things. We need to really sniff in order to smell something. If you just are inhaling, only very, very intense odors will get to the receptor cells. But dogs have this dedicated route. And finally, they actually sniff much better than we do. I didn't know until recently that there was a better or worse way to sniff, but it turns out there is, and we have the worst way. First of all, we don't sniff that much. If you take a sniff, and maybe we can all take a collective sniff now. Can we do this? It takes about 1.5 seconds to fully sniff. Dogs sniff about 5 to 10 times a second. So they're getting all these different odor images in a second. But there's more. They exhale better than we do. So you all know that if you want to get a smell out of your nose, you exhale. That's fine. It gets the odor right out of it, but dogs don't want to exhale. They want to have an olfactory picture that's continuous in front of them. Like we keep our eyes open to see, they want to keep their noses open to smell. And so these fluid dynamics researchers have found that they actually exhale out the side slits of their nose, not through the inhaling nostrils. And what's useful about that is they can continuously smell while they're exhaling, like a wind player doing circular breathing a little bit. And if you watch a dog who's close to the ground, you might notice that when they exhale, a little puff of dirt comes up. They create what are called expired turbulent air jets from these nostrils that actually stir up more odor molecules to be smelled in. So the whole mechanism is really designed for perfect smelling. That's before you get to the brain. This is a little picture. This is called a cortical representation, where you draw on the body how much of the body is represented by the brain. And in this case, if we looked at how much of the body of the dog is represented by the olfactory lobe, by the olfactory cortex, they would have a nose like that. You know, their olfactory, their sensory ability is massively overrepresented in their brain. So what does this allow dogs to do? It allows dogs to do things like this. tracking dogs can detect, follow people who've been by hours, days, sometimes weeks before. Now, we can all tell which way this person walked. But what if the waves have come up and covered the footsteps? Well, the tracking dog can tell in 5 footsteps which way the person went. It's about 2 seconds worth of steps. And that's because the odor concentration between the first and the 5th footstep is sufficient that they can tell a difference. And odor tells time. The stronger smell is the more recent footstep. The weaker smell is the more distant footstep. So the stronger one is the direction the person is going. What I did in my book is watch a lot of working dogs in training, and you see a lot of behavior like this. This is an old picture from National Geographic, where the dog has a collar, an LED collar around his neck, and he's following the trail of a pheasant that was dragged across the grass. What you see is that they zigzag back and forth until they find the scent source. What they're doing there is really measuring odor gradients. That the odor is strong and they go to the side, it gets weaker and weaker, they know to turn around and go back to the stronger one. So they're following the strength of the odor over time. So what I did was tracked some tracking dogs to try to understand what they do. For instance, I went to the Pacific Northwest where I followed truffle detection dogs. We have truffles in this country, and there are teams of people and dogs trying to find them. You enter a forest, you see nothing. 3 seconds later, the dog has found a truffle. I went to the Penn Vet Working Dog Center, where they're training detection dogs to be general purpose good searchers and finders so that they can be later placed with Border Patrol, with the police, with search and rescue. And what they do is create things like this amazing rubble field, which looks like a pile of trash, and that's what it is. It's kind of supposed to represent a building that has fallen and that might have survivors within it, which a search and rescue dog is trying to find. And if you're really gullible, you put on a hard hat and you hide in one of the places in this rubble field, and you cover the tube, and one of the dogs who's learning how to find people 3 seconds later thunders by, sniffs heartily around the top of that tube, and barks an alert. What I learned about these dogs, these tracking dogs, is that no dog needs to be trained to smell out people, to smell out explosives, to smell out drugs, to smell out illegally imported rhinoceros horns. They already know how to do that. What they're trained to do is to keep looking until they find one particular scent. And that at the end of that game, they'll get a tug toy in reward or game of chase. They just need to be told to tell us when they smell these things, but they already smell them. At the Penn Working Dog Center, they're doing cancer detection research, and this dog here is being led around a series of canisters, one of which has plasma from a patient with ovarian cancer. And what they do is train the dog to alert to a very small quantity of the ovarian cancer. We don't even know what it is in the scent that the dogs are detecting, but dogs are highly reliable at finding the cancer. In my own lab, I do research which is very straightforward with dogs, where I am trying to investigate their olfactory universe. For example, one study I did, I basically presented dogs with 2 plates, allowed them to sniff both. One held 1 piece of hot dog, one held 3. Now we know that if you give a dog a choice between 1 and 3 pieces of hot dogs, there's not a problem in choosing. They'll always choose 3. But I thought, if they're such good smellers, what if we cover the plates and we present it to them? So we do that, and then we give them a choice about which one they want to go to. To our surprise, they chose randomly. They definitely spent longer sniffing the hot dog plate with 3, but they chose randomly. I was trying to figure out why. We did another trial where we had the plates exposed so they could see 1 and they could see 3. And we had their owners then go up to the plate with 1. and lift up the plate, and the owners were very cooperative in doing this, and say something like, "Oh, this is so yummy," and put it down. And then we had them choose. And the dogs chose the smaller amount, reliably, if preferred by their owners. So what I started to realize is we have this interesting tension where dogs have amazing noses, but most dogs in their life aren't asked to smell anything. In fact, as we walk together, they are asked not to smell, right? We yank them away from smells. We tell them not to go and sniff another dog. We don't experience it, so we don't really want our dogs to experience. They're kind of losing their nose. When I realized that, I let my dog, Finnegan, who has been allowed to linger at a lot of tree bases and smell a lot of dogs, try to open his nose even more, and I took him to nose work class, and if you've never been to nose work class, you really should go with your dog, because it will become their favorite place on earth. What you do there is basically simple detection dog work, where you teach them to find a hide, which is a neutral odor, and they get rewarded for it. And so here's my dog approaching. Now he jumps on a lot of windowsills also. Obedience and nose work don't always go hand in hand, but he's a much happier dog. The other part of this book was me trying to figure out what it might be like to be a smelling creature by trying to smell more things myself. The first thing I thought I would do was just let my dogs lead me. What they were smelling, I would try to smell. That seems straightforward enough. So we walked down the street and they sniff something and I would kneel down and sniff it also. It turned out this is kind of socially awkward. And not always great smelling. So I decided to follow some experts' advice. There are plenty of expert human noses, perfumers, sommeliers, animal trackers who navigate by smell. I practiced with all of them. I learned what they did. None of them, by the way, started out as a great nose. They all became good noses, and all they did was what dogs do. They bring things to their nose and sniff. They bring their nose to things. If you have something in your hands now, it has a smell. We aren't bothering to smell it. I did a smell walk around New York City with a woman who does smell walks. She's trying to map urban smellscapes. She gathers colleagues together, and we go to different places, and we start off always very awkwardly, standing around, and then we start smelling things. And within a half a block, we've suddenly noticed that there was this rich, detailed world which we weren't aware of, which is right in front of us. And this tree, by the way, because it was a New York City tree, smelled really like car exhaust, I'm sorry to say, because trees actually absorb the exhaust from the cars. Here's one of the animal trackers smelling the meal that an eagle who landed in the snow left behind. They can track by sight, of course, but they also use their nose, and they're not afraid to smell things. This is something that we used to do. Doctors used to diagnose by smell. Typhoid has the smell of brown bread. Tuberculosis has a smell. Diabetes has a smell. I think that if we want to understand what it's like to be a dog, we should be better smellers ourselves. So I want to sit down with Danielle and talk a little bit more about the book and about her dog. But I will say a couple of things that are kind of my takeaways from this project. And if you read the book, I hope you'll take it away as well. One is let your dog sniff. Our dogs are sniffing creatures, and their world is olfactory. When we open our eyes from sleep, we see the world, but they awaken and smell the world. And the world is wrought differently of smells, and I think we owe it to them to let them appreciate that. Take them on smell walks. That's something that I do with my dogs, where we don't try to make good time. We don't try to get a long walk or get to the post office and back. We just let them guide our walks. And sometimes our walks are a lot of standing around and smelling, but that's an important part of their experience. Take a smell walk yourself. Follow the dog's lead and bring things to your nose and sniff. And if you're interested in understanding what it's like to be a dog, the mind of the dog, you will be part way there yourself. Okay, thanks. I'm going to bring Danielle down with Riley.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Danielle, and this is Riley, my therapy dog. And we're very excited to be here.
Thanks. Thanks for joining me.
Do you want to sit?
Upstaged by a dog, always.
I know. Who isn't? So one of the things, I really loved your book. I think probably because I have a working dog. You know, he's not like the scent detection dogs that you studied, but he's still a dog that I had to train, that I had to go through a process in order to work with him. And so for me, reading your book was fascinating and interesting from the perspective of how many things they can do just from their sense of smell. Right?
Yeah.
And so the first thing that I wanted to ask you about, because you were talking about the aerodynamics and the way the nose works, and what I was interested in, and you didn't talk about it there, was you have written in the book that when they approach a stimuli that's neutral, they will go from their right nostril and then the left nostril.
Right.
But then when it's maybe a threatening stimuli, only the right nostril.
Right.
And I wondered if you could talk more about that.
Right.
And how that happens?
I mean, it's kind of amazing to think that they're using their nostrils
Separately.
separately. For one thing, they have stereo olfaction. So in other words, they're getting a little different odor slice of the world from each nostril, like we get a different slice of the world from each eye, and then the brain recreates it. So they're smelling not just that something's there. We enter a room where someone's made coffee and we're like, yeah, coffee is in this room. But they're entering the room and saying, coffee is in this room and it's there, it's that far away, or it's behind me, or it's to my left and right. And then it turns out that by looking very, very closely at dogs' nostrils and presenting them with different stimuli, they found that dogs start sniffing with their right nostril first. And then as Danielle said, if it's something which is familiar odor, they skip to their left nostril to sniff. But if it's something which is an aversive odor, something they don't like, and what they used here as the aversive odor is kind of wonderful. They asked veterinarians to swab under their armpits, and they presented that to the dogs. And so, of course, veterinarians are mildly aversive to dogs because of the places veterinarians put their hands with dogs sometimes. So then they just sniffed with the one nostril. So you wouldn't want to look too carefully, but you could tell if a dog was feeling suspicious of you by whether they're just doing right nostril sniffing, basically.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Because as good of a dog as he is, and I don't know how many, I'm sure most of you have dogs. I live in the city, so a lot of times we go out and we're walking and we greet another dog, right?
Yes.
And he's a pretty friendly dog, but every once in a while he'll have a bad reaction to another dog.
Right nostril.
And so now I was thinking, I need to watch how he's sniffing them, and if he only turns his head one way, maybe that's because I've been trying to figure out a tell.
It might be a cue. It might be
a cue that I could pick up on?
Yeah.
And that's what I was wondering, if I could use that as a cue.
You'd have to get very, very close.
I have to get
possible.
close, because it's subtle?
Yeah, because it's subtle.
Okay.
I mean, have you ever noticed your dog using his nostrils differently? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to pay
Has anybody
attention
noticed
now.
I mean, they can move their nostrils in these gymnastic ways. There's a lot of musculature of the nose.
So cool.
And they can really flare differently, and as we know, exhale separately from inhale. So, isn't that right? Yes. Yeah.
So I thought that was really fascinating. And the other part that I thought was so interesting was and you talked a little bit about it, but you didn't talk about all the different groups of dogs that you followed, because you did the truffle dogs.
Yes.
You went to Pennsylvania, you went to their training site, and there was the search and rescue dogs and the cancer detection dogs, and then what was the term? RDH?
HRD, the human remains detection.
And you studied them, but you also studied you talked to some man who's a conservationist.
The scat detection dogs.
The scat detection dogs.
Right.
Can you talk more about that?
Right, that's great. Dr. Sam Wasser at University of Washington. Right, that's a good one. Who, so if we think, dogs are detecting explosives or drugs or, illegally imported bananas or something, you think, well, what do dogs really want to detect more than anything? Like, just any guesses what they want to detect, apart from food, really? Poop! That's it! Right, exactly. They're so good at it, right? All our dogs are poop detection dogs. So Sam Wasser goes to shelters. He doesn't use purebred lines of detection dogs, and he finds what he calls the high energy dogs, the ones who really look obsessive, who actually might be really hard to adopt out. He's interested in these dogs because they'll do anything for their ball, or for their tug, or for a game. And he basically just trains them on the scent in this very simple way of presenting them the scent, getting the reward, hiding the scent, making them search for it. When they find it, getting the reward, of various populations of animals that he's trying to track, that he's trying to get the population numbers of. It's very hard if you're trying to canvass thousands of acres to see how many bear are living there, how many moose, to count all the animals. But the dogs can find the scat. And so he does that. And then he has this one dog, Tucker, who's a beautiful black lab, or a mix, who we found in his shelter, who he takes out on the boat in Puget Sound. And this is his orca detection dog. And in fact, Tucker detects the scat of the orca, which apparently, this is a lot of stuff about orca scat, maybe you didn't want to know, but it floats to the surface for about 30 minutes and then it drops. So you have about 30 minutes after the orca's been there to find where it is, approximately. And he can do this up to a nautical mile away. And he points which direction the scent is coming from. And if the boat overshoots, he turns and points in that direction. And his reward, again, when they find it, is tug toy.
I mean, I thought that was amazing that he could, they're on the water and they're looking for orca poo. I don't know how big orca poo is, but he can detect it from a mile away on the surface of the water. I mean, to me, that was amazing. It
is amazing. I mean, I think the limit of what these dogs can do is more our imagination about the types of things that could be smelled than it is what their nose can do. Who knows what Riley is detecting right now? It actually makes me a little alarmed to think about, right? Yeah.
That was one of the takeaways that I had from the book, was the potential, the possible potential for the way that dogs could help us in our lives as humans in different ways, and especially, you know, the conservation dogs and helping with that, but the cancer detection dogs I was fascinated with, and I had heard some stories about that, but I was wondering, you know, what do you think the possible sort of outcome could be from that? Because they're still, I know they're not actually using them in hospitals.
They're still testing, right? They're not in hospitals.
But what could it possibly be with cancer detection?
Well, it could go into a clinical situation eventually, right? I mean, this is a proof of principle right now. The research they're doing is saying, like, can dogs really detect this? Because we don't have instruments that we can design that are sensitive to these early volatiles from cancer. So can there be a dog that would go out and smell patients? Well, as it turns out, the reason we even started doing this research was because of owners who had a dog who was like always sniffing their leg, something like this. Actually, this was in the 90s. This was first published in the 90s. There was a woman who had a dog who was sniffing her left thigh all the time, sniff, just wouldn't get away. And after a few months, she went to the doctor to have it checked out, whatever it was, and it was a melanoma.
Yeah.
There were a couple of cases like this, anecdotal cases, where owners noticed non-trained dogs noticing something on them, and it turned out to be a cancer, in most cases malignant. So the dogs can smell disease on us, right? Does this mean that we should go home and get naked and like let our dogs sniff us? Find the disease. You know, I mean, if you want to do that, that's your thing. But it's not that the dog reliably knows to tell you about it. But certainly, disease has a smell.
Yeah.
Right? And we might not always know what it is, and the dog might not know. I mean, the dog almost certainly doesn't know that's cancerous, but they know it's different. It's not your smell. The dog knows your smell, and then they can detect something that's different. So, you know, if your dog is worrying over something on your body, I would absolutely have it checked out. I mean, just why not?
Yeah.
This could be put into practice with trained dogs. And certainly then dogs also have this therapeutic function. So there would be a double benefit, right? We know that, you know, petting dogs can lower our blood pressure, can lower our heart rate. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of double whammy. There are great possible uses there.
I found that fascinating, and it just made me wonder about all the possibilities that we haven't even thought of. So one of the things I was thinking about, because of course I'm a psychologist, I work with kids, I work with lots of kids that have anxiety, so as I was reading, I was like, well, can dogs smell emotion? Because we know from basic emotion research in humans that we have things that happen to us physiologically when we experience a certain emotion. And I was like, could we actually train dogs to differentiate between different emotions and have certain responses to those emotions?
Right.
Is that possible?
I don't see why not. I mean, a lot of emotions have something which would be a smell correlate. So for instance, anxiety, if you have a lot of stress, cortisol, is we give off a hormone, basically. It's in us and it would effuse from us. Dogs can probably detect that. So the question is, would you tell them what to do in that circumstance? Any therapy dog then has something they do when they notice a smell. So yeah, it's possible with some emotions that they could. Yeah.
Well, because they're already using dogs, and this is another group of dogs that you talked a little bit about, was the epileptic seizure dogs.
Yes.
And of course the diabetic alert dogs, because the diabetic alert dogs are actually smelling, right, when the blood sugar drops. That's what they're smelling.
I know, that's a particularly strange one, right, where they're smelling blood sugar dropping, lowering blood sugar. That's what they've been trained on. Again, this is at Penn, they've done this research, and they don't know exactly what it is in the lowering blood sugar that the dogs are smelling, but they're able to distinguish it from normal blood sugar levels, and they alert to that.
Yeah, which I think is amazing. He was actually imprinted as a puppy to be a diabetic alert dog because the breeder that I got him from did it with all of them, because all of her dogs, a lot of her dogs go into service. And so she didn't want to preclude any of them from not having that, and I guess the training has to start when they're very young.
Yes.
So she told me when I got him, I said, well, I'm just going to train him to be a therapy dog with kids. And she said, well, if he ever gets really excited around someone's mouth, I was like, their blood sugar's low? And she's like, maybe.
Potentially. Yeah, right.
But I don't know if you could do, I can't imagine it's one trial learning. They must, but they're,
I mean, if they've been trained on it, you know, the thing
that
is
possible?
when one of these dogs is put with a person, if the person is healthy, if they don't get a lot of alerts, then they might stop too. I mean, it would either be a very frustrating experience right away, like, shoot, my owner is healthy all the time. No, I mean, because the blood sugar gets them the reward, right? So they have to be in regular training.
They have to get reinforced.
Where they're reinforced. So yeah, if you're healthy, you go into the facility where you've been trained, and maybe they hide something so that dog can find it and get rewarded. So potentially the training would extinguish. But maybe not, right? Or maybe they would at least notice it and give an alert. If they gave an alert behavior, I would certainly, if you gave an alert behavior like a bark or a sit, I would certainly pay attention.
I don't think it would happen with him, but I just found that interesting that the imprinting happened so early on. I don't know if that was just her particular thing.
Might be, but it wouldn't hurt to imprint it early.
I would think so.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I was wondering about was, you also did your own journey yourself. You were talking about it at the end a little bit, and you did all kinds of things. You went and met with a woman who did Chinese medicine, right?
Yep.
And she
traditional
had learned
Chinese medicine,
from traditional Chinese medicine. She did a lot of her diagnosis through smelling.
Right. Yes, exactly. And traditional Chinese medicine uses smell as one of the diagnostic components, and with ideas that we all have smells, and our smells can be off. And if your smell is off, that's diagnostic, that something might be wrong with you. And in their way of looking at the world, the people have different smells. You might smell more like earth or water or metal and so forth. So she smelled me. I asked her to smell me, which is itself a strange thing to ask a stranger, and then also strange to have someone smelling you. But yeah, it's still used in Eastern medicines as diagnostic. I'm a little surprised it's not in Western medicine anymore, because I definitely know people who work, microbiologists who work with infections, say infections have very strong and distinctive smells. And sometimes that would be something that's noticed, like a lung infection on a breath, before maybe you even have an experience. If you've ever known somebody who has dental decay, that's a smell, right? So before we even know or realize that there's something wrong with us, that we have an odor connected to it, and we have the capacity to smell it. as well. But we're choosing not to.
Yeah, and so then when you were going on, you showed the picture going with the woman
Yes.
through New York City, and then you
Yes.
had the experience with the non-Western medicine woman, and you had a bunch of these experiences. What would you say, and you tracked with the trackers?
Yeah.
She showed a picture, but in the book she talks more about, she goes out with these trackers where they smell all these trained animals. What was the most interesting one for you?
Well, they were all great because, the perfumers are amazing in being able to deconstruct perfumes into its components, and the sommeliers, it's a real thing. They can, we would test trying to discover the notes of wine by using a really neutral wine, and they'd pour a little bit of the scent that you might find in that wine into it. Like some of the example scents were like canned asparagus juice, which is in a lot of whites, or they'd put like a handy wipe or a Fruit Loop into the white, and that would help you notice that there's a smell that resembles a handy wipe or a Fruit Loop in your wine. Wine still sort of tastes like wine to me, but I can smell it now. But the animal tracking was probably the most amazing thing to me, because you go out and it's freezing day, and you don't think there are any smells. In the cold, it's really hard to smell. Smells need to be moist and warm and rise from the ground to reach our nose. If they're all under the snow, you're not smelling them. That's why the smell of spring, right? You might know the smell of spring. It's like all these odors that have been stashed underground in the winter are like suddenly rising to our nose. But animal smells in the cold actually are pretty distinctive, because there's a warm-blooded creature going through this cold environment. And so one of the guys could smell a moose, it's an oaky smell. We smelled a bobcat odor on a trunk, and I was very proud, maybe unduly proud, to have identified a porcupine by the smell of his pee. Because porcupines eat, you may or may not know, now I know, hemlock, and so their pee smells really piney. And they're very messy also, so they just leave their smell everywhere, because if you're covered with spines, you can be really messy. So their smell is everywhere, and it is very distinctive. So we found his den by following our noses.
So what do you think would be your hope for people? I'm sorry, Riley's crying. Come here,
No, I
come here,
too.
come here. What's wrong?
Why?
Are you not getting attention? What would be your hope for what might come out of your book? What people might gain from reading this book? What are the possibilities that could happen from your book being published, from people reading it?
Thinking about our dogs, we want to indulge our dogs and treat them well. And we have a lot of ideas about dogs liking the things we like, and so we give them the gourmet food, or we give them birthday parties, or we dress them in raincoats, because those are all things we really enjoy when it's raining.
It's true.
And I think it's important to try to imagine if we want to treat them well, and I think they deserve it, because they do so much for us. They're so cooperative, they're so loyal, they're such good companions. We have to imagine their world. It's an olfactory world, and give them something which allows that to flourish. Let them sniff each other. The nose work, if you're interested in doing a sport with your dog, which is really just a matter of hiding things and letting your dogs find it, is incredibly orienting and organizing of their life. Sometimes I've heard from a lot of people that dogs who had anxiety or reactive, fearful dogs get a little calmer when they have something like nose work to do, and I think it's just allowing them to use their nose. Let them smell like themselves once in a while, if you can stand it, because dog doesn't want to smell like your shampoo. Dogs want to smell like themselves. That's who they are to themselves and to other dogs. And I also think that it's actually, the second thing from this book that I came away with was a real appreciation of this ability that we have on our face as well, not dog-sized, but still pretty good, to smell the world. Given that we can taste, taste is mostly smell. We're just chewing, and the odor is going up the back of our mouth. And you all know this, if you ever have a cold and you can't taste food, that's because you can't smell it. Flavor is mostly smell. So we have a decent sense of smell. But why are we so hesitant to smell the world? When you intentionally go out and smell things, then it doesn't feel like smell is happening to us and just the horrible smell that hits us or a great smell that hits us. It feels like you're just exploring the world, this dimension of the world we haven't noticed. So I hope some of you will sniff things tonight.
Danielle, first of all, I want to check, is Riley good? Does he need to leave stage? Is he okay?
Yeah, he's just a little.
A little? Yeah. If you need to stand up and walk around with him a little bit, that's fine.
With him.
And actually, before we get then to audience questions, I don't know that maybe give some people some sense as to what you do with Riley in session.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to just entertain him a bit here, because I think what he's reacting to is he's been sitting for a while, and honestly, the reason why, I don't know how much time have we been on stage?
You have been on stage with Alexandra about 20 minutes.
So some of it is that he's in an environment that he's not used to, and also it's not quite the time limit, but he has, I guess it's what you say when they sense time. I wonder if a
certain amount of time before
he knows that I'm on a 50-minute session, and no, he does, and at the 50-minute mark, even if my client's not done talking, Riley will stand up like, it's done, why are you still here, and walk to the door. And so he's very used to specific environments. This is an unusual environment for him, but what I do with him, now he's going to calm down again. What I do with him, the reason why I got him is because I work with a lot of kids that have anxiety. And by kids, I mean anywhere from 9 years old all the way, I do work all the way through the lifespan, but I work with a lot of teenagers and preteens and kids. And the reality is that therapy for kids is much different than adults. Like, I can sit here and talk to you for 50 minutes and we could hold a conversation and you would be fine. Kids usually don't want to just sit there and talk, right, for 50 minutes. It's hard for them. And when you're talking about kids who are dealing with some really deep emotional pain, and talking about it for adults is difficult, but for kids it's even more difficult because they might not have the language for it, they may not have, their brains haven't been fully developed to process that. So I use him a lot as a way, one, for comfort, right? So he'll lay at their feet, they pet him. It makes them feel more comfortable in therapy, I think, because it feels more like a home. Like, they might have dogs too, so it feels like I'm not going to the doctor's office, but I'm going someplace that's warm and comfy. They've developed their own relationships with Riley, And then I also use it as a way when kids or teenagers are having a hard time talking, sometimes we'll go for a walk with the dog, and then sometimes just being outside and walking and maybe looking around, they're actually able to talk about things that might be way more difficult for them to talk about if I was sitting here face to face. Because they might not have to make eye contact with me when they say that really hard thing. So I use it in a lot of ways, and the other way is because I used to have to come up with all these creative play things to do with them, and now I have a live toy in my office. It makes my job a lot easier. So those are the ways in which I use them: for comfort, for building rapport, and for making it be, when there are more difficult things to talk about, he just makes it easier, I think.
Alexandra, did you have any questions for Danielle before we take audience
No,
questions?
that sounds fabulous.
Okay, great. All right, so let's give them a round of applause and we'll take some questions.